Do I need a full frame camera, or is APS-C good enough? Is there a quality difference between full frame and APS-C? Can you shoot professionally with an APS-C camera? How much better is full frame to APS-C in low light? These are some of the many questions any photographer has when potentially looking at buying their first camera or possibly upgrading to a new one. And it can be hard to choose, also confusing because both sensors have their advantages but equally both sensors have their disadvantages. So in today's video I'm going to be answering all of those questions and more, plus clear up some common misconceptions when it comes to full frame versus APS-C. The primary difference between a full frame and APS-C camera is the physical size of the sensor. Full frame sensors are sized to be similar to the former 35mm film format and a 36mm by 24mm. Crop sensors are smaller and come in roughly 24mm by 16mm. Crop sensor cameras tend to be aimed more towards beginners and hobbyists, as the sensors are smaller than their full frame counterparts, and because of that they are cheaper to develop, meaning that the cameras plus the lenses designed for them tend to be more budget friendly. Cameras that are full frame are targeted more specifically towards professionals, so are more expensive, and professionals don't mind spending extra money on a camera as usually they are making money with it. However, the gap between full frame and APS-C cameras has significantly narrowed over the years, and that's because the technology found inside these cameras is getting cheaper to develop. It's why features that are once exclusive to high-end professional full frame cameras are now being implemented into cheaper APS-C cameras. It's a development cycle, and this actually benefits up and coming creators, as the APS-C cameras that are now rolling out from any major camera brand are equipped with some top-notch specs. Wow, try and say that 5 times fast. Top-notch specs, top-notch specs, top-notch specs. Much of the time when you talk about APS-C cameras, people are concerned about the level of quality, that be image quality, low light performance, and the background blur or bokeh you can achieve with an APS-C camera. As already outlined in the past, the quality difference between full frame and APS-C cameras has been down to the amount of effort these systems have been given by their respective manufacturers. For example, my first DSLR camera was a Nikon D5200, and at the time I think Nikon's flagship camera was a Nikon D800, and the quality difference between those two cameras was huge. But today, if I showed you a photo taken with the A6700 and the A7 IV, put them side by side, you won't be able to notice a quality difference. So if your main concern is about professional quality from an APS-C camera, you can just cross that concern straight off your list. Now let's address the crop and the background blur between these two systems. This is a bit of a spicy topic because there is a lot of confusion and misinformation surrounding this. Some people say that if you want to achieve more background blur, get yourself a full frame camera. Others say it's the same on both systems. The truth is, on a technical basis, they are the same. However, in the real world, with real world use, there is a difference. Putting this into a visual context, if the same photo is taken with the same lens, just with different sensors, the image circle projection into the camera is the same. The difference is the larger full frame sensor can capture a larger piece of the image, and the APS-C camera can capture a smaller crop of the image. So an image taken on an APS-C camera is identical in every way to an image taken on a full frame camera, except the APS-C sensor will have a crop, usually by 1.5 times. Anytime you use any lens on an APS-C camera, you must times that focal length by 1.5 times to get the equivalent focal length, meaning that this 85mm lens on an APS-C camera has the equivalent field of view of 127.5mm. And this is where APS-C cameras do hold a bit of an advantage over APS-C cameras, and we'll get onto that in a moment. There are a total of 3 factors that impact the amount of background blur a photo has: the focal length, the distance, and the aperture. If those 3 things are identical, then no matter what camera you use, it be full frame or APS-C, the background blur will be the same. So people who say APS-C cameras have the same amount of background blur to a full frame camera are correct, because sensor size has nothing to do with it. But say you want to achieve the same field of view on an APS-C camera to a full frame camera, what you're going to need to do is one or two things: use a wider lens or stand further back from your subject. Using a wider lens changes the focal length, and standing further back changes the distance between you and your subject. As a result of changing one of these 3 things, the background blur has changed. Now if anybody's still a little bit hazy on the details between full frame and APS-C with the background blur on the bokeh, I can actually illustrate this point a little bit further. If you're not, please feel free to skip to the next part of the video. So Right here, I have the Sony a7 IV set up with the Sigma 85mm f1.4, and on screen you can see the bokeh and the background blur that is being produced. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that photograph at f1.4, and once I've taken that photograph, I'm now going to press this button here, and this will crop into the image, and this is actually gone into an APS-C mode. So this is acting just like an APS-C camera would, and what you might have noticed is the background blur is identical, nothing has changed. And if I take that photograph, we can put them side by side, and you can see again the background blur is identical on both. The only thing that has actually changed between those two images is the crop factor. As a matter of fact, you can actually take the APS-C image and place it within the full frame image, and they will match identically, even down to the bokeh and the background blur. The differences between a full frame and an APS-C camera can be exploited. For example, it's much easier to get a wider shot on a full frame camera than it is an APS-C camera, but then it's much easier to get a more telephoto shot with an APS-C camera than it is a full frame camera. So take this 70-200, you put this on a full frame camera, that is the exact focal length you'll get, 70-200. But if you put this same lens on an APS-C camera, you'll have to times that focal length by 1.5 times, meaning that you now have the equivalent focal length of 105 to 300 millimeters. Now you could always crop into the image of your full frame camera to get the same field of view as the APS-C camera. However, if you do, the image from the APS-C camera will be higher quality. You see, this a6700 has a 26 megapixel APS-C sensor. This Sony a7 IV on the other hand has a 33 megapixel full frame sensor. So if you crop the full frame image to match that of the APS-C image, you'll lose a lot of that information and you are left with a 16 megapixel image, whereas the image taken on the a6700 is still that full 26 megapixel. So if you're someone who finds himself shooting a lot of sports and wildlife and you need that extra reach, you might be better off looking towards an APS-C camera. However, there are cameras designed with higher resolution sensors. For example, the Sony a7R5 has a whopping 61 megapixel full frame sensor, and if you did the same amount of cropping on a 61 megapixel sensor to achieve the APS-C field of view, you'd end up with a 26 megapixel image, which matches that of the a6700. Let's now talk about noise, ISO, and low light performance. Historically, people have always said here full frame is better than APS-C, and generally speaking, that tends to be true. However, we need to go into details here because that's not always the case. So as a very basic understanding, if we had two brand new cameras, both equipped with 24 megapixel sensors, but one was full frame and the other was APS-C, the full frame camera would indeed be better in low light as it has a larger sensor, a larger surface area, so the pixels found on that sensor would be larger, more light efficient than they would be on an APS-C sensor. Meaning that yes, in theory, a full frame camera is going to be better than an APS-C camera in low light. However, we need to understand that not all full frame cameras are created equally. Full frame cameras have always been targeted towards professionals first, but the scope in which what a professional requires from a camera can vary drastically from creator to creator, which is why on the market we see such a larger array of full frame cameras all ticking different boxes to meet the needs and criteria of different pro shooters. So let's take Sony as an example here. Their R line of cameras are focused more specifically towards photographers first, so the sensors found in them cameras are going to be higher in resolution. Their S line of cameras are focused towards video shooters first, who require great video specs and low light shooting capabilities, so the sensors found in them cameras are going to be lower in resolution. Their hybrid line of cameras, like the Sony a7 IV, are targeted towards hybrid shooters, people who shoot both photo and video, so the sensors found in them cameras are not too low in resolution, but they're not too high either, they're somewhere in the middle. So with that in mind, the Sony a7R5 has to squeeze 61 megapixels into a full frame sensor, and because of that, each of those pixels on the sensor are going to be pretty small and not very light efficient, which is why the a7R5 isn't the best in low light despite being a full frame camera. On the flip side, when you look at the a7S III, which is also a full frame camera, it only has a 12 megapixel sensor, but each of those pixels are going to be much larger and much more light efficient than on the a7R5, which is why the a7S III is so good in low light. And to demonstrate this, on screen is an ISO test between the ZV-E1, a camera with identical sensor to the a7S III, against the a7 IV. And whilst this isn't a 61 megapixel sensor sensor but rather 33, we can still see, despite both sensors being full frame, that the one and the ZV-E1 is handling this low light scene much better than the A7 IV. Which circles us back to the point I made a couple of minutes ago that not all full frame cameras are created under the same umbrella. There are different full frame cameras out there created to meet the needs and criteria of different pro shooters. Now jumping back onto the APS-C side of things, in the past they have not been as good in low light as their full frame counterparts. But over the years this has improved drastically on APS-C cameras, as again the technology has gotten cheaper to develop, so it is now being dished out into these cheaper APS-C cameras. And we can actually see this development in ISO performance when we put the A6000, the A6400 and the A6700 next to one another. You can see how over the years the performance continues to improve. Now what's really interesting is when you compare the A7 IV's ISO performance to the A6700. Both of them perform fantastically, no doubt about that. The A7 IV does hold the advantage, but the margins between the two are so minute. Also, take into consideration how much I've had to zoom into an image to notice this noise in the first place. And that's an important factor to bear in mind. If you zoom into any image, you're going to notice noise. But if you look at an image in the way it's intended to be viewed and the noise isn't ruining that experience, then I think it's fine. Putting all of this into some form of perspective, bad back then is not bad now. Even cameras that we don't consider to be good in low light, let's take the A6000 for example, I'd still say that that is good enough for most people most of the time. I mean, I've been able to take some brilliant shots of it down in London in the past, and most people wouldn't even know that these photos were taken with an A6000 unless I told you. And even if I was a little bit worried about the ISO performance and it was a little bit grainy, I can use tools like denoise to help clear some of that up. So that's always something to take into consideration as well. Now, a lot of time when I hear or see people struggling with their cameras in low light, it's almost as if they're expecting their cameras to be able to see in the dark, and that's not realistic. I also think that from the perspective of someone who's on a bit of a budget and can only afford an APS-C camera, that when they do encounter noise, they automatically assume that a full frame camera would perform better. But as demonstrated, not all full frame cameras are created equally. Some are better than others in low light. In fact, some APS-C cameras might actually be better than some full frame cameras when it comes to ISO performance. And even these days, the ISO performance between the latest full frame and APS-C camera can be ultra marginal. In my opinion, most full frame and APS-C cameras will get the job done most of the time. I have no less faith in my A6700 than I do with any of my full frame cameras. So there are other advantages to APS-C over full frame that should be taken into consideration. The first one, as we've already mentioned, is price, not just for the cameras but the lenses too. I mean, for the price you pay for the body of an A7 IV, you can buy an A6700, a Sigma 18-50, a Sigma 56mm f1.4, and still have some leftover Wonga. We then have size and weight. APS-C cameras and lenses designed for them are typically much smaller and lighter than their full frame equivalents, making them an ideal choice for travel or street photography. And then again, of course, we have the increased reach with the crop factor, which makes it easier and more affordable to achieve more telephoto effects with APS-C cameras, ideal for people who want to capture more distant subjects. Throughout this video, I have made a lot of points on why you should get an APS-C camera, but am I going to be one of those people to do that whilst I go out and do the opposite? I mean, right here, I have a Sony A7 IV, I'm filming on the ZV-E1, but I do also use crop sensor cameras a lot. Recently, when I was in Lisbon, for the entire trip, the only camera I used for photography and video was my A6700, and to capture any B-roll of me using that camera, I just used my iPhone. When I was in Paris for 2 days, I only used the A6400 for photography and my A6700 for video the entire trip, because those cameras felt like a better choice for traveling and allowed me to maintain a compact setup. But recently, I attended the Goodwood Festival Speed and I used my A7 IV, which for me was the right tool for the job, and here's why. As mentioned earlier, professionals tend to use full frame cameras, and it isn't just because of the full frame sensor, rather the extra features those pro bodies may have. Full frame cameras are often equipped with dual SD card slots, faster burst shooting, maybe more video features and extra buttons, as well as a more robust design and more weather sealing to handle more extreme conditions. And that's why I deemed my A7 IV to be better than any of my APS-C cameras to tackle that project. Now, if you find yourself shooting in more extreme conditions conditions you are shooting professionally and getting paid, then yeah, it might make more sense for you to have a full frame camera. A big advantage full frame cameras have over APS-C cameras is the full frame look. So earlier in the video I said that if you want to achieve the same field of view as a full frame camera, you either have to use a wider lens or back up further from your subject. But obviously in a full frame camera I don't have to do that. I can still achieve a wide shot and not lose that background blur that I would have lost if I was using an APS-C camera and had to change lens or back up further away from my subject. This tends to give your subject a bit more separation, but realistically speaking you'll never notice a difference unless I showed you the two side by side. And most people who will be viewing your photos like this will never be able to tell what was taken on a full frame or APS-C camera. So to summarize this very long video, it is a great time to own a camera. You really can't go wrong with what's available on the market. Don't get me wrong, every camera has its own advantages and disadvantages, but that's to be expected as there's no such thing as the perfect camera. Also take into consideration, regardless of the sensor size, what really makes all the difference is the lenses that you'll be using. And one final bit of advice from me today is to not get lost focusing too much on the gear. It can be really easy to get caught up in all this technical jargon. What really matters when you're doing photography or filmmaking is the final result. And that is where I am going to be leaving today's video, looking at full frame versus APS-C sensors. This has definitely been the longest tutorial video I have ever done on the channel, and I do hope it has been extremely insightful, helpful, answered many of your questions and cleared up some of the common misconceptions. But if you do have any further questions, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. Follow me on Instagram if you're not already, like today's video, subscribe, all of that great stuff would be really deeply appreciated. But with all that said and done, until next time, create, explore, and inspire.